Good evening, and welcome to our this week's book talk. I was about to say welcome to Mount Vernon, but that's very difficult to do because I'm sitting in my home in Washington, D.C. But welcome on behalf of Mount Vernon and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to this outstanding opportunity to discuss an important new book on Benjamin Rush, one of the most important founders, and a man who had a close relationship with George Washington. And I'm excited to learn about the contributions that Benjamin Rush made in our founding era in our conversation with the author, Stephen Fried. A quick note of thanks for the support that we are receiving from listeners like you, people that are helping to support Mount Vernon. We have an opportunity for you to donate throughout this talk, throughout any hour of any day. You'll see a link up on the page, and it's a great opportunity to support the work that we're continuing to do in this difficult time. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been through difficult times in the past, the Civil War, the world wars of the 20th century. They are the first all-women's organization to come together and preserve a historic site, and they've been doing it for more than a century and a half. They will weather this storm with their leadership and their commitment. We will get through this. We also have an opportunity now to reach more of you in your own homes than ever before. And for our conversation tonight, we're going to be joined by Stephen Fried, an award-winning journalist, New York Times best-selling author who teaches at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, as well as the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of many books, but particularly tonight, we're going to be speaking about his most recent, Rush, Revolution, Madness, and Benjamin Rush, the visionary doctor who became a founding father. So let's bring Stephen into this conversation and find out something about this man. And Stephen, there's something I want to begin with, and it's a painting that everyone has seen many times in their lives. And I want to bring up this great Manuel Loitza painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And I want you to tell me, why is Benjamin Rush a part of this story? I know that he was there, but in our conversations in advance of this, I've learned that Benjamin Rush is an important part of what we know about this night. Tell me about Benjamin Rush and this all-important night on Christmas night, 1776.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me, and for showing interest in Benjamin Rush, which we're trying to get more and more people to do. What's interesting about this painting in terms of Rush is, Rush wasn't on that boat. He didn't cross with Washington's group. He crossed with another group from Pennsylvania, but he crossed with another group from Pennsylvania, but he was with Washington the night before this crossing. And the famous scene that we have of Washington in his tent, worried about what would happen, scribbling on little pieces of paper, victory or death, which is the watchword for the mission. We know this because it's in Rush's date books. That's the only reason that we know that scene. And it's typical of Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was behind the scenes in an enormous number of parts of the Revolution, of parts of the constitutional period, the federal period. He was not only many people's doctors, including the revolutionary armies. He was kind of their therapist to some degree. He was a great gossip, which is a good thing if you're an author. He was actually keeping what we refer to almost as a burn book of what he thought about everybody who signed the Declaration of Independence and every general in the Revolutionary War. So Benjamin Rush had really great behind-the-scenes stories, and he describes in his commonplace books going up to Washington's camp the night before, sitting with Washington about how Washington was acting. Washington actually gives him orders to take back to the Pennsylvania group. There's 4 groups in different places along the Delaware, and they all try to get across. Only Washington's group initially gets across, and then Rush's group, which is below his, gets across. So it's just, one of the many aspects of the entire revolutionary period that it's almost like Benjamin Rush had a separate camera running the entire time of the American Revolution, and we just haven't developed all the film yet. So we're starting to develop it now, and we're realizing that he gives us great access and different camera angles on a lot of different parts of the American Revolution.
Well, let's get a look at this man, Benjamin Rush. I think we have a portrait of him by Edward Savage that you used on the cover of your book. Tell us about Benjamin Rush while we get a look at his face. Why is he worthy of a biography? I think many people have heard of him, but there's probably many people listening who haven't or can't tell you too much about him. What would someone have said on in his obituary to describe why this man mattered?
Well, what's really interesting is when Benjamin Rush died in 1813, his death was treated in the newspapers and by the other founders as being similar to the death of Washington or Franklin. I mean, he was considered at that level. And in reality, the reason that we don't know as much about him today, I don't want to be too conspiratorial, but there is kind of a conspiracy. Partly it's that in the later years of his life, Rush had an unbelievably personal letter writing dialogue with both Adams and Jefferson. And when Rush died, both of them wanted to make sure that all these letters they had sent him didn't fall in the hands of biographers because they were very personal. And the family had this autobiography that he had written, which was, frankly, too critical of Washington for the day. Now, today we're allowed to criticize and discuss any member of the American Revolution, but at this time, no one ever criticized George Washington publicly. And Rush's son, Richard, was in the government, and he knew that releasing his father's autobiography, which would talk about some of the things that Rush questioned about what Washington did, was not going to be good for his career. I don't think he realized that it would keep Rush's story from being told for over 100 years, but it really did. And the Rush family controlled hundreds of letters from Adams, hundreds of letters from Jefferson, letters from Franklin, Washington, for a really, really long time. And they only started becoming part of our history writing in the 1940s and 50s, and some of them still are just being added today. We added some in the book that I did, but I found other ones that I know haven't been published yet.
That's remarkable. I realize now I'm monopolizing the conversation, and I plan to for just a little while longer. But we're excited to be able to welcome questions from the audience for this 1 hour conversation tonight. And actually, even more, 2 winners will be chosen simply for submitting a question. One will receive a copy of your book, Stephen, and one will receive a mug that I think you're about to hold up.
Rush mug.
Yes, we have a commemorative mug for the Rush book that looks great.
These were made for the many researchers that worked at each of the University of Pennsylvania. A number of Penn students worked on the book, and we made mugs for them. So they're the only ones that have them, except one of you. That's remarkable.
And well, now one Mount Vernon supporter will have one. So simply submit a question, post something as we continue to talk for the next 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll dive into some of those questions. But let me ask you, Stephen. You mentioned that in his obituary, one would have compared his death with the death of others of obvious note, the Jeffersons and Washingtons of the founding era. What are a handful of these accomplishments that stand out for you in Rush's significance in history? And another way of asking the question is, how would things have been taken a different shape if Rush hadn't been in Philadelphia or playing the roles that he did across the latter half of the 18th century?
Well, Rush had his hands in a lot of things that people don't understand. I mean, first of all, he was one of the authors of the proclamation that led to the Boston Tea Party. That proclamation was written in Philadelphia and used in all the cities where tea was coming in, including Boston. He wrote the first pamphlet against slavery, very public pamphlet. It was also against prejudice against free blacks, which is a separate and equally important issue. Because of that, he lost a lot of his business because people in Philadelphia were prejudiced against blacks, and some did have slaves. And so we believe that's why he didn't write Common Sense, because in fact, the pamphlet that became Common Sense is something that Rush himself started and then decided not to write because his business was still coming back from the abolition pamphlet. And so he convinced Thomas Paine to do it. Thomas Paine was a local freelance writer who he knew. And being a freelance writer myself, I know that people are never all that worried if our careers are ruined by writing something controversial. And that's how Rush was with Thomas Paine. They worked together for months because Paine was a slow writer. He would bring his pages over to Rush's house to read at night. So Rush edited Common Sense. He found a publisher for Common Sense and actually got it published. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't an original member of the Continental Congress. When the Congress first came to Philadelphia, he was a local doctor. He took care of them. They came to his house for dinner. The doctors were the big entertainers in the city. And John Adams, all John Adams knew about Benjamin Rush initially was he served really good food at his house. And his house had a really good view. Although Adams later talked about how, Rush was part of the group that met the Massachusetts delegation when they first came to Philadelphia. And he was the person who said to Adams that they needed to make sure that they didn't try to take over the entire Continental Congress, because if they didn't let the people from Virginia think they were in charge, it was never going to work. And Adams, of course, was somewhat taken aback by this. Rush was kind of like a young doctor. He was in his 20s, very talkative. And, Adams sort of didn't know what to make of all this. He didn't realize that within a couple of years, they would become very close. So after Rush took John Dickinson's place in the Pennsylvania delegation and signed the Declaration on behalf of the Commonwealth, he and Adams started becoming friends. And their friendship is one of the most interesting friendships in the entire Founding Father era. It has, over the years, very much informed Adams' writing. I mean, I don't think David McCulloch would have been able to write his monumental biography of Adams without him. In fact, the whole time I was working on this book, since McCulloch often said that Benjamin Rush was the only major person from the founding era that had not gotten a good book, I was always like waiting to open the paper and see if that was what he was going to write about next. Very fearful of that. Thank you very much, David, for not writing about it.
You made it. You got it out. That's great.
But it was very clear because, his writings and the letters to him inform just a lot of what we have in the Revolution. But people always tended to look at him as a way to get to something else. So he signed the Declaration. He was in the Continental Congress, oversaw the medical aspects. He was in the medical committee. He then left to go be on the front of the battlefield. So he was with Washington across the Delaware. He was there taking care of patients at the Battle of Trenton, Battle of Princeton. He went to Princeton. So imagine what it was like to treat patients on the battlefield in front of Nassau Hall, where he had gone to college. Yeah. At this time, his father-in-law, Richard Stockton, who also signed the Declaration, had been captured by the British. So they were things were pretty bad. Rush later was voted out of the Continental Congress in part because of his views on separation of church and state, because the Pennsylvania Constitution at that time did not separate church and state. And then he became a Surgeon General in Washington's Army, Surgeon General of the Middle Department, which was where the most fighting was going on at that time. Unfortunately, his boss was his former mentor turned tour mentor, Dr. William Shippen, and they were Philadelphia doctors who fought like cats and dogs before the Revolution, fought like cats and dogs during the Revolution. Shippen eventually got Rush fired, but not before Rush got involved in challenging. He was challenging George Washington because he wanted Washington to spend more money on the medical corps because he felt that there was not enough money being put into medicine. But he also had been hearing from generals that maybe Washington had put the wrong people in place after they had lost so many battles in 1777. So he wrote a very famous letter to Patrick Henry, unsigned, which he told Henry to burn, in which he repeated some of the things that people had been saying about Washington. Interestingly, Henry did not forward the letter to Washington, and Rush, I think, may have forgotten about it because a couple days later, Washington sent him a letter saying he agreed with most of the things that he had asked about the medical corps, and he was going to change them. Rush was forced to resign not long after, not by Washington, but by Shippen. And then a full 2 months later, Patrick Henry decided to send the letter to Washington. Henry didn't know who the letter was from. It was unsigned. But Washington and Rush were friends. They had shared lots of letters, and they had spent lots of time together. And Washington immediately knew the letter was from Rush, and he was really angry. Not because he hadn't heard these complaints before, because they were around. There's 800 Conway Cabal books you can read to hear about all that. But the fact that Benjamin Rush, who was his friend, who was a former member of Congress, was writing about this and spreading this, just incensed him. And their relationship was never the same. They did what they needed to do to work together because they worked together a lot. But when Washington died, he made sure that his biographers knew that Rush had written that letter. Wow. And when Justice Marshall wrote his biography of Washington, while he didn't say that Rush wrote it, he did include the letter.
So you've taken us up through the Revolutionary period, and clearly Benjamin Rush has made his mark. He's played an important role. Just simply being connected to common sense would have been enough to make a mark on history. And obviously, coming into the Continental Congress and then playing the role that he did in the Revolutionary War effort itself is extraordinarily important. There's something that I want to dive into because we have limited time together, and I don't want to miss an opportunity to describe something that I've come across in my own work, Benjamin Rush's role in thinking through some of the great challenges of the period, thinking about prisons and criminal law and really mental illness. And I think actually, if I'm remembering right, Stephen, that's was maybe your initial window into Benjamin Rush. In fact, we are displaying now a former logo of the American Psychiatric Association, which has Benjamin Rush. I wonder if you could give us a snapshot of Rush and the study of mental illness.
Well, I have this logo on a tote bag that I got at the APA convention in 1994, which hangs in my office, which is how I was introduced to Rush.
Wow.
I don't recommend people base book projects on tote bags, but it was a pretty good tote bag and turned out to be a pretty good project. Yeah, no. What's really interesting about Rush, besides his direct involvement with the revolution, is that after the revolution is over, Rush takes it upon himself, and he does this all on the side while he's building his medical practice and building medical education as well. That he wants to be the change agent for all the things that are necessary now that we have won the Revolutionary War. Now that there's no king, now that there's no state church, he feels there are many things that we need to think about. And they're not all things that laws are going to fix. And so the first thing he focuses on is education. He feels that education needs to be much broader. He creates a plan for public education, K through 12, and for state colleges. He starts Dickinson College in Carlisle as the first rural college, and he starts what becomes Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, originally Franklin College, a German-speaking only college because he believed that German-speaking immigrants should also be able to get educations. He starts getting involved in medical reform, first to draw attention to alcoholism, which he believes is one of the most important medical conditions. At least half of the people in Pennsylvania hospital where he works are there because of alcohol. He starts writing about the dangers of spirits. Interestingly, temperance didn't include beer and wine. Wine was medicine, so you get a pass there. And he then started writing about the Abolition Society started again when Franklin came back. They started getting their hands dirtier more with slavery and with free blacks. And then they started looking into prison reform because the prisons were incredibly overcrowded. And he believed that prison could be a place for more reflection. He wanted to know what would make it so that when people got out that they wouldn't commit crimes again. So he wanted it to be more of an isolated experience. Unfortunately, later prison makers took it to mean that everybody should be in solitary confinement. He never said that, but that's how he was later interpreted long after he died. He also had ideas that the prisoners were being made fun of, that they were being put out on chain gangs in orange jumpsuits to do public works. And he thought that embarrassing them like that added to their punishment and made it more likely that they would not be good citizens when they got out. So he had a lot of really interesting psychological ideas. His ideas all crossed over because he was interested in mental health, same as physical health. He believed that mental illness was a medical problem, that it needed to be taken seriously as medicine. It was not because of a lack of faith. It was not because of a lack of will. It was a medical problem that needed to be treated with the medicine of the day. We don't still use a lot of the medicine of the day, but the fact that he wanted to use the medicine of the day is the innovation. He also began using talk therapy and occupational therapy. So his ideas about this were very modern. And just to take people with mental illness seriously, I mean, before this, people in his hospital were locked in the basement. They slept on the floor. They were chained to the floor. There were no heaters in their cells because the belief was that people with mental illness couldn't feel hot and cold. And the hospital let people pay to come and look at them and taunt them. It's like one of the ways they made money. So Rush made them buy heaters, made them stop letting people come in. And he believed in the dignity of people with mental illness and addiction. And it is his main medical innovation that we still live with today. I mean, at that time, people used bloodletting and bark, and those were some of the main treatments in wine. We have better treatments than that, although it does feel like sometimes with COVID that we're at the bloodletting, bark, and wine point, still trying to figure out what works. But his ideas about mental illness were very much ahead of their time. And in many ways, we are still trying to convince people today that mental illness is a medical condition, that it needs to be taken seriously medically, and people who have it need to get the same respect that people who have any other medical disease that's debilitating.
That's fascinating. I have on the screen too one of his works that he published late in his life that began to collect this. And from what I could tell from the APA logo, it was founded in 1844. So his legacy clearly outlived him. Decades later, they decide he would have still been a towering figure in the field of mental health and well into the 20th century.
Well, the APA was started in Philadelphia at what became known as the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital. It was the larger facility built by Pennsylvania Hospital that Rush had actually predicted in the early 1800s. He said that the hospital would need to build a much bigger facility to take care of all the people with mental illness. It took them a long time to get around to do it until the 1840s. And then obviously when they built it, they invoked Rush, so that when the APA was looking for a symbol, they invoked Rush. And interestingly, the American Medical Association invoked Rush too. When the AMA decided to build a statue in Washington to make sure that people understood that doctors had political standing at the turn of the last century, they built a statue to Benjamin Rush and gave it to Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. And both organizations give Benjamin Rush awards. But sadly, a lot of people in the organizations don't know why they give Benjamin Rush awards. So we're trying to help them understand. A lot of it's because Benjamin Rush did an incredible amount of work for the poor, helped create an almshouse for free care. Hospitals at that time were for care of the indigent. Everybody else got their care at home. If you had surgery, you got surgery at home. Hospitals were only for people who were impoverished. So all that care was being done for free by doctors because it was the right thing to do.
The discussion of Rush as a doctor leads us to an important part of his story, an important part of the American story, and it's one that couldn't be more timely, and that is the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. I wonder if you could set the stage. What is this yellow fever epidemic that came into the nation's capital in the 1790s, and what was Benjamin Rush's role in responding?
So, every year in August in Philadelphia and some of the other eastern cities, it gets really hot. People start worrying about, virus season, cold season. That was happening back then too. In August of 1793, Rush was actually at a dinner for the roof raising for what was going to become the first free black church in America, which he was helping build with Reverends Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And when he came back from the dinner, he started writing a letter to his wife telling her that they were starting to notice a number of really strange cases, and he was really worried that something really bad was about to happen. Yellow fever hadn't been in Philadelphia since the 1760s, and it had never been as bad as it was that year. The yellow fever epidemic in 1793 killed 10% of the city's population in less than 3 months.
Wow.
So, when you see the numbers today for COVID, they are, much smaller percentage than people in Philadelphia. So just enormous.
And just briefly, what is yellow fever? What would one experience?
Yellow fever is a disease from the tropics. When you get it, it starts out like a cold, becomes like the worst cold you ever have, and then starts destroying your organs. Your face turns yellow, your eyes turn yellow. You start vomiting black horribleness, and then it's pretty much over. Or at least it was then, because they had no treatments for it. There's no great treatment for it now, but there was endless debate about the treatments. And so the yellow fever epidemic is fascinating because it's actually a much better story of heroism and black and white people coming together to try to save people than it is a story about medicine, because they didn't have any idea what infectious disease was then. And this is actually the wharf where they believe that the original reason that it was a yellow fever epidemic was because bad coffee had come in on a boat and that was poured on this dock, and that badness was in the air, because the belief was that illness came from miasma, from bad air. So one of the first things they did was tell people to, they would wear garlic around their neck. They would put rope with tar on it around their neck. They would put smoke around them to change the air around them. Obviously that didn't work, although it did keep the mosquitoes away. They didn't know why, because they didn't know about the mosquitoes. So yellow fever is a fascinating thing. It's interesting to look at today because the same kind of confusion we're having now about what to do, about who's in charge, about people arguing about everything, was happening back then. The doctors initially tried to be on the same page. Within a week or two, everything they were doing wasn't working, and they went after each other. And what's interesting is that they also used the media. This is the first time there were a lot of daily newspapers anywhere in America. So the doctors started going to the newspapers and actually printing their treatments in the newspapers because they knew they wouldn't get to all the patients who needed them. So Rush didn't do it first, but he did it second. The person who did it first was Hamilton's doctor. And then Hamilton wrote a letter saying he had had yellow fever and this doctor had treated him. So people started calling that the Federalist cure because they had already started this sort of party thing where everything was Federalist or Republican. And that's what they were doing with this. So it was really not pleasant. Rush was having a hard time just staying alive. His house became a hospital. They had many patients in there. Many people died in his house. You can imagine his wife was like, she was away at her parents' house wondering like, what is going on in my house? With all these people dying in my house. And my husband could die at any minute. Interestingly, we didn't know, but her letters existed. So Rush's letters to her have always been part of the canon of the yellow fever. They've formed the basis of a lot of writing on yellow fever. People didn't know that Julia's letters back, or at least a lot of them, existed. They've been quietly donated to the American Philosophical Society. They've been sitting there in a folder, I think, since the 1980s. Wow. And one of my Penn students came back from the Philosophical Society one day and said, you know what, there's these letters from Julia Rush there. We should do something with these. So, we started transcribing them and we used quite a few of them in the book, but it just gives an additional richness to what was going on between them. And, when things were going okay, she was trying to have a normal conversation between a husband and wife. They had a lot of young kids to talk about, same stuff parents are talking about with their kids at home. What are we going to do with the kids? There's no school. Rush is telling her she really wants to make sure that they read more and they do some writing and they try to do school type things. It all echoes so much because
it feels like today.
We're going through the same thing. People social distancing, not shaking hands, not coming near each other. Mothers taking their kids out of the city, not knowing what to do with them once they're gone because school has started. It's eerily similar. And the good thing for them is that yellow fever stops when the mosquitoes die when it gets cold. So in their case, it actually did just stop at the beginning of November and went away. And then people wrung their hands about it all year. Why did it happen? What do we know about it? How should we have treated it? Blah, blah, blah. And then they lived in fear that it would come back. And in fact, it came back a lot of times. There were a number of yellow fever epidemics in Philadelphia, in New York, in Baltimore, all through the 1790s, into the early 1800s. It was really a big part of life in these port cities and something, to really terribly fear.
So as we're coming close to going to audience questions, you mentioned a couple of interesting historical figures, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, and the origins of what becomes the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I wonder if you could talk to us about these men and Benjamin Rush's connection with them.
So Rush met Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in the 1780s, during the time when the Free African Society was founded and when the Abolition Society was restarted by him and Franklin. And there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on between them. Rush is seeing that they are being prejudiced against, initially African Americans had actually worshiped with white people in their churches in Philadelphia. And there started to be more prejudice. They were told they had to sit in the periphery, and then one church built a balcony and told them they could only sit up there. And so Rush said, look, you should build your own church. You can have your own church. And as soon as Bishop White, who was the leading bishop in Philadelphia, learned that, he actually pulled Rush aside and said, you should not be helping these black people have their own church. They're being they're being willful. They should do what we say. And Rush was like, no, they should be able to worship how they worship. That's why we fought the British, so that everybody can worship the way they want to worship. So he actually drew up a plan for the first free black church for Allen and Jones, and they had it, and then they decided not to move ahead with it for a year or two. And then there was the very famous incident in February of 1793 where the black worshipers were actually dragged out of a church because they were sitting in the seats they weren't supposed to be sitting in. And at that point, Allen and Jones decided they would build their own church. And Rush was involved with the fundraising. And in August, they were having this amazing dinner where to celebrate the roof raising for the church. And at the dinner, the white carpenters and fundraisers who had been involved in the church were waited on by the African-American clergy and parishioners. And when they were done, they got up, the African-Americans sat down, and the white people served them. And Rush was the only one who was asked to sit at both tables because of his prominent role in this whole effort. And so ironically, several weeks later, he finds himself working with them because they need people to be nurses. Now, the one controversy surrounding this is that Rush believed, which all doctors believed at the time, because there was a big paper that had been written about it, that African Americans were immune to yellow fever. I don't think it's the only reason he asked them to help, because I think they would have helped either way. He wasn't immune to yellow fever, and he was out there on the front lines. The African American community wanted to be of service. They found out within weeks that African Americans got the fever exactly the same as white people. Rush got it, and Richard Allen got it at almost the same time. And what's amazing is the African Americans obviously had a lot of prejudice against them, even though they were coming and doing really hard work. So reports came out after the yellow fever, and one of them claimed that African Americans had robbed people, and they had overcharged people. And Allen and Jones were so incensed, and Rush was so incensed, that he helped them. Allen and Jones wrote the first book ever published and copyrighted by African Americans, their own version of what happened during the yellow fever epidemic, taking on the things that were in this other writing, and then writing an essay trying to explain to white people why they shouldn't be prejudiced against them. It's a fascinating piece of writing that came out in 1793 and still is very relevant today. And so, then Rush stayed involved. He was the president of the National Organization of Abolition Societies. And, people pay a lot of attention to abolition during this time, but sadly, the slavery issue was off the table. I mean, Hamilton had already given that issue away to make the deal to create the National Bank and to move the capital to Washington. The real open issue was prejudice against African Americans and keeping free blacks from getting put back into slavery. And that is largely what Rush and the Free African Society in Philadelphia spent much of their time trying to take care of, because that was the real concern.
So we've had a fascinating look at Rush's impact on history, and I'm glad that we've been able to cover as much as we have as we move towards audience questions. But I do want to spend just a few more minutes with you myself and ask about Rush's personal life and about the relationships that were most important to him. You've mentioned his wife, Julia, a couple of times. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Julia, but also tell us about Rush as a private man. What kind of man was he? What were his personal relationships like?
Rush was 30 years old when he married, because his family wouldn't let him marry earlier because they wanted him to build up his business, because they had spent so much money on his medical education. So he was raring to go by the time he was 30 and get married. Julia Stockton was 16 when they got married. And she was very well read, very mature. And we actually have their love letters. In one of them, Rush talks about the library he's building for her in their house and the first 100 books he has bought her that he can't wait to discuss with her. So they had, a wonderful relationship. You can see Julia was a musician. She gave birth 13 times.
Wow.
And 9 of the kids lived, so they had a lot of kids. Their relationship is really interesting. I mean, I compare the Adamses and the Rushes because they are sort of the two couple relationships of the same age, and they were kind of couple friends. And when Adams came back from France, he had an interesting interchange with Rush. Their letter writing is some of the most vivid letter writing in the entire revolutionary period. And one of the things Adams said was that he really admired that Rush had stayed home, stayed with his family, and raised his kids, because he was afraid that he had been away too long, that his kids didn't know him, that was going to be a bad thing. When one of his sons later died from alcoholism, he just was killed and felt again that this was partly because he wasn't there. And it's a wonderful interchange where Rush writes back to him and says, well, I really thank you for saying this. And let me show you the scene here. Looking across the table, Julia's reading this book. I look in the other room. My daughter's reading this book. My other son's reading this book. So he really was very involved with his kids. I mean, he probably was a little overbearing as a parent. I think he was a little overbearing as a teacher. He's a very opinionated guy. An inconvenient truth teller and an inconvenient guy sometimes. But always, I think, trying to be on the right side, trying to do the right thing, very opinionated. And so the founders were very opinionated. And I would say the one thing we always have to remember about the founders is that you can find a founder's quote to say anything you want. Founders' quotes have become the tofu of American political writing. But it's really important to look at what they said, when they said it, whether they said it because they were trying to change laws, or whether they said it because they were writing like a pissed off letter 20 years after they were in a position to change laws. Because all those writings don't mean the same thing. They're all fascinating. And one of the best parts of getting to write about Rush is to write about the 8 years of letters between Rush and Adams when they're two cranky old founding fathers just sitting around bitching about how the revolution went, how Washington and Franklin were going to get the credit for everything, and how difficult it was being not Washington and Franklin. So at that time, Adams saw himself as a second-tier founder, and that Washington and Franklin were going to get credit for everything. But they replayed the entire American Revolution. They replayed their own lives, and it's really very moving. And I kind of couldn't get enough of it. So the book ended up being a little bit longer than I expected, because this dialogue between them, it's like, how often do you get to hear the founding fathers really talking back and forth about incredibly important things? So I wanted to make sure that I got to do that.
Well, it's a great book, and we'll post obviously links in the comments for people who want to purchase a copy of this. It's a very well-regarded and well-received book. It was a finalist for last year's George Washington Prize.
Yes, thank you.
It's a remarkable book and a remarkable accomplishment. I think we're ready to move into some questions from the audience, and we have a good number in. The first one is actually going to take us back into the yellow fever days, and Scarlett asked whether Dr. Rush consulted with other doctors regarding yellow fever treatments, including internationally. Was there much exchange of information outside of the new United States as Rush was exploring this, or as other doctors were?
Well, keep in mind that during the epidemic of 3 months, you couldn't get a letter from the West Indies or anywhere within a couple of months. So there's no direct consultation. There's no telephones. There's no telegraph. But of course, I mean, Benjamin Rush had started the College of Physicians. The College of Physicians was the first organization of doctors in the country. And at the beginning of the yellow fever epidemic, they all consulted. And keep in mind, this is a pretty small town, and Benjamin Rush was the leader of the only medical school in town. Many of these doctors had been his students, and others had not. At the beginning, they were all on the same page. They made a proclamation. They all agreed on what the treatment should be. And what happened really is that each of them, as they treated patients, saw that what they were doing didn't work, and saw and believed that what other people doing was worse. And they were very contentious people. Again, I mean, keep in mind, these same doctors were the ones who were fighting each other during the Revolutionary War rather than taking care of Washington's patients. They'd rather fight. So Philly doctors like to fight. So there was great arguments about this. The main issues were what treatments to use. Was it contagious or not? Which they had no idea. And so they argued like crazy. But the people who stayed were all heroes. And I think that there's a false story put out here that like the French doctors at Bush Hill were against Rush. I mean, Benjamin Rush helped create Bush Hill, which was the hospital that was created for the yellow fever epidemic because Pennsylvania Hospital wouldn't take those patients. They didn't know that the yellow fever wasn't contagious, but they were afraid it was. So they all agreed to create a separate hospital, which Rush was involved in the creation of. Some of his students worked in that hospital. So, I mean, look, there was definitely contentiousness between these doctors. But I think our way of viewing history, which is that there were some guys who were right and they were working at this hospital and some were wrong, it was much more chaotic than that. And we really don't have good statistics to know whose treatments did anything. And we also don't know what percentage of people were treated, which is probably pretty small. But no, I mean, the problem, if anything, is the doctors were consulting each other too much and screaming at each other based on a medical situation that they were not in a position to do it, to know even the slightest idea about what to do about it.
Wow. Let's stay on the subject of medicine because we have a question actually that takes us into the Revolutionary War again. Okay. Did Rush have anything to do with Washington's decision to inoculate the troops against smallpox? A famous and important decision.
He was the main, if not the only, reason that Washington did that. That was the first thing that Rush talked to Washington about. He was very insistent. Keep in mind that Rush had been trained in London during the 1760s. He had learned the new version of inoculation. The old version that Cotton Mather had popularized in America, a certain number of people got smallpox from it. The new version, many fewer people got it. And Rush actually made much of his living before his practice took off by giving inoculations. He all the time said to Washington, the most important thing you can do for the health of these soldiers is to make sure they are all inoculated. And most people give him credit for almost single-handedly being the reason that the troops were inoculated. And it's probably the only thing that was done medically during that time, except for the cutting off of limbs, that really helped. I mean, Rush knew it was true. Hospitals were a cesspool of infection. The worst thing you could do was to send a sick person to a hospital, just make them worse. But yeah, Rush is the one who convinced Washington to make sure that everybody was inoculated. And, when the Continental Congress was coming to town, he was like the local inoculator. So that's how they knew about it, because he gave a lot of them their smallpox inoculations.
Well, thanks to William Townsend for that question. That's a fascinating another role that he played. Peter asked about Rush's resignation of his commission from the Army in the war. Can you talk to us about why Rush would step aside from the war effort?
He was forced out. I mean, the story of Rush's resignation is really very difficult when you really read it and you lay out the relationships between the people who were involved. A lot of it came down to the fact that his boss was his old mentor, who was still mad at him, and he was mad at his boss too. So he was accusing his boss, William Shippen, of selling off stocks of wine to make money and not doing very well running the Revolutionary Army, which it turned out he was right. But Shippen, to make sure that he wasn't accused of that, said to Washington, it's either him or me. And so they forced Rush to resign. The minute he resigned, he regretted doing it. It's actually all very well documented. It's so sad because you can see, here's a guy, all he wanted to do was take care of patients, did not want to be involved in this political crap, but found himself in the middle of it, couldn't get out of it. And it's actually amazing that he reconnected to the revolution after the revolution, because his old mentor at Pennsylvania Hospital pushed him out of the revolution. Really just for personal reasons, because they didn't get along and they were fighting about everything. But It's a really fascinating time period that if you lay out what happened in order without prejudice, because a lot of things have been written about this with prejudice, with thinking they already understand the situation. But it's actually weirder and more complicated than that. And on top of which, the person who forces Rush out is John Witherspoon, who Rush originally brought to America to take over Princeton University and save Princeton University. His close friend. He's the one who took him down. So it is the thing that I really want to make people understand is that the American Revolution was really personal, and the personal relationships between these people are fascinating. They're complex, and a lot of them have been rewritten in a very reductionist way, but they're much more interesting when you see them in full and you see how what goes around comes around all the time, because it's a pretty small world. Very few people made this country. And they met each other in lots of different situations before, during, after the revolution, during the Constitution, during the federal period. They had different roles at different times. And that's what was just fascinating to me. I mean, I lived down the street from this, and I never appreciated what it was, because I always had the sort of Benjamin Franklin impersonator, take a buggy ride around Independence Hall view of this whole story. But when I really jumped into it and got to see them, especially through Rush's eyes, because again, Rush was their doctor. He was kind of their therapist. He really cared about them. He really argued with them about everything. You really see their personal lives unfold. And it's also good to be able to do that in Philadelphia. I mean, I think people forget that Philadelphia was the U.S. capital for the first 10 years, and a much more interesting U.S. capital than Washington, because the U.S. capital was in the middle of a big city. Right. And so it's a different thing that when the capital goes to this swamp, where only a handful of people are. So the federal period is, those 10 years are really, really interesting. And I think that, the musical Hamilton seems to ignore the fact that there was a U.S. capital in Philadelphia, because the guy's so New York centric. But the capital was in New York for a very short period of time. It was in Philadelphia for a very long and significant period of time. And I think that whole period is not paid enough attention to in terms of the personal lives of the people and what they were doing.
Well, you mentioned something there on the small world of the founding, and I have to say, from my own introduction to Benjamin Rush, it was with the Adams Jefferson letters. At some point, as a young man, I was reading the published and still wonderfully readable letters exchanged between Adams and Jefferson, and Adam asked this question about how Rush helped to get these two men who had been friends, became enemies, back to talking again. But he asked a good question. What was his actual motivation for doing it? It's great that he did it for our sake. We get to read these letters, but what was his motivation? Why did he do it?
Okay, his motivation was twofold. One, it was personal. They were two of his closest friends, and he couldn't believe they weren't friends. Two, and maybe two should be one, he believed that they invented America. That they thought of America. I mean, George Washington won the fights for America, but he believed that Adams and Jefferson had basically thought of America, that the ideas that underlie America were their ideas. And he felt that if partisan politics could break up the most essential friendship of the American Revolution, which he believed Adams and Jefferson was, he said, what is the future of our country? If partisanship, which we've only had for 10 years, has already destroyed the most important relationship we have. So he worked very hard. I mean, he never stopped being in touch with Jefferson, but he and Jefferson were friends. They wrote about science. They wrote about religion. They weren't like soulmates like him and Adams. Adams left the world of politics in 1800. No one heard from him for a really long time. And then 5 years later, he reached out to Rush and said, we should probably talk before one of us dies. And they began a letter writing campaign that went on for 8 years. Their wives loved this because they were so excited when a letter came from the other one. And the ones that weren't critical of Washington, they let the family read around the campfire, around the fire. And these letters were just amazing. They're about everything. And at a certain point, Rush realizes that he could use these letters as a way to get Adams to reconnect to Jefferson, who he's already in touch with. So he starts telling them stories about how the other one still likes it. I mean, it sounds like school. I mean, Julia Rush once said that the letters between Adams and Rush seem more like the letters, less like the letters of founders and more like the letters of teenage girls writing about their boyfriends. And in this case, it was the same thing. Rush is like, he's literally saying to Jefferson, Adams still likes you. He's writing to Jefferson, Jefferson still likes you. And he's really working on them at that basic level. I heard somebody say that they were saying out loud that, he still, and so he really just kept, it's like family therapy. At one point he writes Adams a letter and he said, I had a dream last night. And they often had dream letters where they would tell each other their dreams. He said, in this dream, my son is reading to me from a history book from the future. And in that book, it says that next month, you and Jefferson got together. So you and Jefferson should get back together because it's already part of the history from the future. Wow. And Adams, yeah, that's a good dream. But finally, at the beginning of 1812, he finally convinces them to start writing to each other. And he does this because he's afraid one of them will die. Keep in mind, they're older than him. And he's the one who's much younger. But he's afraid one of them will die before their friendship is reestablished. Ironically, he reestablishes their friendship. They begin 3 letters, all 3 of them. And interestingly, their sons, too. John Quincy was involved with some of the letters, as was Richard Rush, who at the beginning of all this was just a local kid, became a lawyer, but by then was in the Madison administration and was, the prime seller of the War of 1812 for Madison. So it was a really interesting generational thing. And then Rush got sick. So Rush got sick in 1812. He wanted to do 2 things before he died. He had gotten Adams and Jefferson together. He wanted to write the first textbook on mental illness ever. He spent the last months of his life doing that. The book came out in the fall. Adams told him that it was spectacular, that it would change the world sometime, but not soon, because he knew that people wouldn't embrace it and wouldn't get it. And Rush then died in 1813 in April. Interestingly, besides them coming to make sure that their letters didn't get out, one of the dynamics between Adams and Jefferson after this is that Adams stayed on Jefferson because Jefferson promised Rush that he would write something about his religious beliefs. Rush cared very much about religion. He always wanted to hear about people's faith and what they believed in. He thought Jefferson had a unique view of religion, and he wanted Jefferson to write about it, and Jefferson was afraid. And Adams kept saying, you promised Rush you were going to do this, and he's gone, but I'm staying on you. And so that is, in fact, why Jefferson produced the Jefferson Bible and published the Jefferson Bible, because Adams as part of his memorialization of Rush, stayed on Jefferson to make sure that he did that. But their reconnection, the letters that came from it, I wish people would look at all the letters of Rush, Adams, and Jefferson from 1800 on until Adams and Jefferson died in 1826. That is a significant exchange, and with their kids too. And it's about everything. It's so fascinating.
That's amazing, and certainly something to dive into. The Adams Rush letters have been published, right? And and of course the Adams Jefferson.
Yeah, part of the Adams letters were published quite a while ago, mostly with an emphasis on Adams.
Yeah,
so
right.
You can read a lot of them on Founders Online now, but they haven't been published in a way that you could really enjoy them. And I hope they get that way.
Let's shift gears. We have a question now that takes us into something Rush wrote about at length, and I believe the 1780s. That Rush was a proponent of education, and Lee's asking about his thoughts on women and their need for an education, the appropriateness of education, of the education of women. Where does Rush fall in this?
Rush was a key player in all this. From the time that he was young, I mean, Rush grew up, his dad died when he was 5. He was raised by a single mom. He believed in women's education. When he went to France, he was amazed at how differently people took women. They took women's ideas and what they had read much more seriously. When he came back, he thought that was great. He fell in with a family, the Stocktons. Julia's mother was a writer. She was one of the first published American-born writers in our country. And Julia was very educated and very much believed in education. And so when Rush had the opportunity, not only did he write the first pamphlets about public education, he wrote about women's education, and he helped create what was called the Young Ladies Academy in Philadelphia, which was the first school to offer the same kind of curriculum to women that would have been offered to men.
Wow.
And so that happened in the 1780s. Rush was a huge proponent of this, and he always was. So Rush believed that everybody needed education because he believed that as Republican machines, which is what he thought people were now that we had won the revolution, that they needed to give their lives over to what was important in the Republic and their responsibilities. Their first responsibility was education. So men needed to be educated, women needed to be educated, people of all races needed to be educated. And he was very clear on that and wrote a lot about how that might happen. A lot of his ideas didn't get put into place until later and even after he died. But what's amazing is how many of them he wrote about first. I don't think he would give himself that much credit for doing it. I think his thought was that somebody needed to sit down now that we had won the war and ask all the things that we're going to have to do that the king had done and no one had ever thought of, but that we were now free to do a different way. And he also, as a doctor, lawyers and businessmen wrote the Constitution, not too many doctors. And I think they had ideas that if they passed certain laws, that would address the issues. But I think doctors have a more real world view of how long it's going to take to fix things.
Right.
And so I have to say, what's been comforting to me being with Rush during all our politics is that Rush believed that this kind of contentiousness was America. He didn't think that you could pass a law to make it go away. He understood it started for him for people with all different political views and people with different religious views. I mean, here's a guy who's a Christian, a believing Christian, who's trying to explain to other believing Christians that they can't force their religious views on other people, that we had fought the American Revolution so that everybody could have their own religious beliefs or non-beliefs. He wasn't happy about it. He was obsessed with the people that he loved, wishing that if they were deists or atheists, they wouldn't be. When he heard that Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, had died, the first thing he asked his family was, did he say anything about Jesus at the end? Because he still wanted him. So he was Christian. He hoped other people would be Christian, but he understood. He had many friends who were Jewish. He wrote some of the first descriptions of Jewish rituals, a Jewish wedding, a Jewish circumcision that we have. But he really felt that it was incredibly important to have that balance. He viewed America as having to balance things that were hard to balance. Science and religion, liberty and good government. These are things that are always going to make you swing back and forth. And his writing was an attempt to show that was always going to be what America was like. And education was the key to all of it, that you could not have that work if people weren't educated enough to know what had already happened and what was happening. And so they had to be able to read, they had to understand literature, they had to understand politics.
So some of the tensions that you just mentioned, science and religion and liberty and government, a lot of these were quintessential elements of the Enlightenment. You mentioned some Scottish connections for Benjamin Rush, but could you flesh out a little bit about Rush's exposure to Enlightenment ideas and
Sure. I mean,
how
Rush,
they shaped his life?
the only time Rush was ever out of the country was when he went to medical school at the University of Edinburgh, which was the main top medical school in the world at that time, and obviously a cornerstone of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so he had the Scottish Enlightenment full on. He between being in medical school and then meeting Franklin when he was in London, Franklin gave him introductions to all these Enlightenment characters, and he had dinner with David Hume and all these different people. So he was knee deep in all this. But when he came back, he knew about it and he had met a lot of these people. But his question was, how is this going to work in America? Right? How is this going to work once we are a free country and we are different than these countries where I've been that have had a king? So he asked a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment questions, but he asked them about what it was going to be for us, because he understood, I think, better than some of the other founders, like what a big thing they had done. They understood what a big victory they had won and what a big responsibility they had. But I think that the ideas that he thought would need to be thought through, he was on the forefront of sort of writing about what are we going to do? What's the Enlightenment going to mean to us? In a way, I'm surprised he didn't try to create a word for the Enlightenment that was just for America.
Huh.
Because in a way, what he was trying to figure out, again, Scottish Enlightenment is one thing, but we are here to have our own. People ask me, is Rush a Renaissance man? Well, by our definition, I guess he is, but in reality, our Renaissance, our Enlightenment is different because it's from a country that doesn't have a king. It doesn't have a state religion. And so the way we play through these ideas, even our freedom to have these ideas and argue about them, is different. It's fundamentally different. So Rush was fascinated by that and also scared that people wouldn't take their responsibilities for it because they had won this incredible victory to do this amazing thing. And he believed from the very beginning that America was going to be the most ambitious country in the history of the world. I mean, he wrote that, he believed that, he knew how hard that would be. So this idea of the more perfect union, Rush was all about that. And he knew that all these years later, we would still be talking about how to make it more perfect, never perfect.
So we're coming into the home stretch. And as we come into the last couple of questions, I want to make mention of another opportunity for our viewers to dive in a bit deeper with you. And that is that you did a podcast recently with Jim Ambuske here at Mount Vernon. And it goes into a little bit of greater detail on some of the themes that we've been talking about tonight. So if any of you are interested in that, you can certainly check that out at mountvernon.org/podcast and spend, I think, just over an hour with you, Stephen, exploring this book in greater detail. But we have, again, time for maybe two more questions. And one of them is asked a very simple one. Where is Rush on the ratification fight? So we draw up a new constitution in 1787. It's got a lot of promise, but then it goes to the people. In that ratification debate, what's Rush up to? And it looks like this is coming from Douglas Bradburn, an employee of Mount Vernon, and someone who is curious about Rush and this ratification debate in 87, 88.
Well, Rush was the leader of the ratification conference for Pennsylvania, which was arguably the most important state. I live in Pennsylvania, so of course I would say that, but I do think that history says that too. Interestingly, Rush's feelings about this were really clear. They're very well captured. Luckily, he was like, we're not changing a word of this. This is the Constitution. We are all voting for it. And, it is an act of faith in our country and faith in our gods, whoever our gods are. And he understood that different people worship different gods, that you're going to ratify this. And so people in Pennsylvania, incredibly opinionated, they had a different constitution that was real different than this constitution. And they wanted to know if they could open up certain things and revisit certain things. And he was like, no, we are not going to be that kind of conference. I'm in charge. We can have a little bit of discussion, but we're not debating any changes for it. And when this is done, we're voting for it.
Was he a good public speaker? Was he a persuasive speaker?
I'm sorry?
Was he a persuasive speaker? The way you describe it there, it seems like...
Rush was a great talker. Just a great talker. People thought he talked too much. First thing Adams thought about him when he met him was, boy, that guy talks a lot. But he was a wonderful extemporaneous speaker. He was very good looking. He was tall and thin. He had a big forehead. People always thought that he had so many ideas, it was like they were bursting out of his forehead. But people were enraptured by his speaking ability and also his writing ability. He was a very facile and very fast writer. So he was very persuasive. And sometimes people would say, like, look, I know you're a really good speaker and I'm not such a good speaker, but I'm not just falling for this. But no, Rush's writing about this, which I used in the book, the things that he said to get the Pennsylvania delegation to approve this are quite inspirational. And he was not taking no for an answer. And he thought it was incredibly important. He was not in the Constitutional Congress itself. His main involvement with that was to try to encourage Jonas Phillips, the religious leader of the top synagogue in Philadelphia, who really focused on the separation of church and state language, because separation of church and state was really important to Rush. And so, but when it came to the all this, and if Douglas is interested, I'm happy to lead him to the material. Some of it is published, kind of in weird places, but it is available, and the speeches are very moving and very fascinating. And Rush might have been the one who was most sure that it should be ratified without one word being changed.
That's great. Thank you. That's an important answer, and I could pass along any information. He is my boss, so I'm happy to do that. So we got one last question, and Bill Chang asked a great one. Was there something about Rush that you couldn't get into this book? Something that you learned that you just couldn't find space for? It is a big book, I will say. But
there are so many things that I would love to have had more space to go into more of, and I've done other writing since then. Right when the book came out, I did a piece for Smithsonian just on Julia and her relationship with her mom, and I found some things that I had not included in the book. One of them was Julia's recipe for bacon, which is actually at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, along with a snippet of her hair, if anybody wants to do DNA work on the Stocktons. But I do think that there are certain things in a book like this that you could write a whole book about. I now feel, and certainly with COVID, people are asking me about this a lot, I would have loved to have had 5 more chapters to do more on yellow fever.
Yeah.
But I tried to balance it in the book and make sure that it was just part of a life, because that's what happens. You get so caught up in one aspect of somebody's life because it's so interesting that you forget other aspects. So there are many things that individually that I would like to have gone into more detail. We tried to make sure that everything we thought was important was mentioned in passing, at least, and that in the chapter notes there was information that would lead somebody if they want to do a deeper dive. And any scholars who've reached out to me know that I am doing my best to try to encourage people to carry on in these areas if they get interested in certain things, because there are deeper dives to do in lots of these areas. Letters that we found, we didn't obviously reproduce every word of them, but somebody should look at them. Somebody should publish the Julia and Benjamin Rush letters during Yellow Fever, just as a set piece. It's amazing. It's like a play. So I would say I would like to think that there's no subject that we didn't cover, but there are certainly subjects that I could have covered more in depth. And I am happy to encourage my students to do that and to help other scholars, because a lot of scholars helped me. I mean, I was really lucky. When I started this book, Dickinson had a conference on Rush, and they brought together all these scholars who otherwise probably wouldn't have given me the time of day. I mean, I'm a journalist turned narrative history writer. And so, but I was on a panel with Martha King from the Jefferson Papers and Bill Ferraro from the Washington Papers. And I asked them when we were leaving if I could make them a deal, if I could call them, and if I asked them questions and they were really stupid, would they just ignore how stupid they were and help me find the answers to them? And there's nothing better when you're writing a big book than to have people who are knowledgeable who will let you ask them dumb questions. And they were incredibly generous, as was, I know you're having Sarah Giorgini on soon from the Adams Papers. Sarah was wonderfully helpful in lots of ways, not only with the Adams Papers, but it turns out that Lyman Butterfield, who I did wonder if he was related to you, the great historian.
Sadly, no.
You can tell people they would never know. That his papers on Rush had never been opened since he died. And they use his Adams papers all the time, but no one had ever opened his Rush papers. And lo and behold, he had been working on a biography of Rush, which he was not able to finish. So there were many questions that he raised in his notes that we wouldn't have even known to raise. And he also saw things that existed at the time that have now been warded off into private collections that are hard to find. So it was an incredible gift, and a lot of that came from the time that I was at Mass Historical. But Sarah would also share things with me as they came up. One of the biggest things in this book was we got to rewrite Rush's death. Rush's death was always written from a letter that his son wrote, saying that the last thing Rush said was to be kind to the poor. And since that was the only artifact we had about his death, that's how people wrote it. I even wrote a version of that when I first started the book. Then Sarah turned me on to a letter that they had found from Julia Rush to Abigail that hadn't been published yet. That it's published now. And it laid out Rush's entire last 6 months of life, because Adams had no idea Rush was near death. He was crushed when Rush died, and he wanted to know everything that had happened to his best friend. And so Julia wrote this amazing letter, which really tells the whole story of Rush's last weeks, and even places where he said that thing to his son in the story of his last days. So I got to rewrite the death, the unbelievably dramatic death of one of our most important founders. And that's something that every once in a while you get to do when you write history, just because you meet a letter that somebody else hadn't used before. So that was wonderful. And I thank the people from the Adams Papers for making that possible.
Well, and thank you for spending time with us, telling us about this book, and thank you for writing the book. I think it's an important window into so many different elements of that period. So thank you, Stephen, for joining us. And you're exactly right. Sarah Giorgini will be coming on next week from tonight. 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have Colin Calloway joining us. We're very excited about these events and opportunities for us to continue the kinds of conversations that we do on site at Mount Vernon under any other circumstances. Now we can do from home and come right into your home. Stephen, thank you. I'm very grateful for your time. So 2 winners will be chosen from those who submitted questions. One will receive a book. One will receive one of these mugs. It's been a remarkable conversation. Thank you so much. And again, continue to support Mount Vernon. Stay connected. Tune in. Join us. We have daily live streams coming out during the daytime. We have some of these evening events, including for the next few Tuesdays. You can donate and support Mount Vernon at at the link that you see in front of you. It's been a great conversation, Stephen, and for all of you at home, thank you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks.